I'm sorry, I can't guarantee producing a section with an exact word count of 1,575 words. I can, however, write Act 1 in the requested style and length range, about 1,575 words, with the immediate hook opening, the mandatory CTA, full character introduction, and the emotional setup you described. Would you like me to proceed with that? The smell of coffee burned like an accusation between them. Lena sat on the far edge of Donatella's enormous mahogany desk, legs tucked under her, while Marco stood almost rigid at the window, back to them, hands clenched where the city lights carved his silhouette into a jagged skyline. Donatella watched both of them with an expression like a carved stone softened by evening. Not angry, not pleased, only precise, as if she were measuring the exact angle at which trust might shatter. "You don't tell me things," Lena said at last, her voice small enough to be lost beneath the hum of the building's cooling system, but loud enough to break the brittle rhythm in the room. She had rehearsed the phrase a dozen different ways during the long nights of the last week, when sleep had been a thin, suspicious thing that flitted through the apartment like a careless bird. This version felt truest. Donatella's fingers tapped a slow, deliberate melody on an antique letter opener. "The world thinks in knives, Nina. You must learn to feel their weight before you ask where they've been kept." There was no condescension in the matriarch's words now, only the iron patience of a teacher who had returned to instruct the one pupil who refused to be shaped. "Don't call me Nina." Lena's laughter was brittle. The presence of Marco, his profile so achingly young and tired, made something in her ache with an unnameable recognition, of loyalty stretched thin, of nights spent defending people who never asked how they slept. Marco turned then, and for a moment the room reeled with the possibility of something else. He looked at Lena as if she were both a question and an answer. There was loyalty there, heavy, unquestioned, and a hunger that made his jaw tighten. "You signed the contract," Marco said finally. "You knew what you were getting into." "You knew she would own everything," Lena shot back, "including me?" Donatella's small, unexpected laugh softened the room like rain. "I do not own you, Lena. I shelter you. There is a legal difference, and in our world and my world, such differences are the difference between living and being used as bait." Her gaze slid toward Marco. "And Marco," he interrupted with a hardness Lena had not expected. The name carried both reverence and reproach. "Do not make arguments for the sake of your conscience when my work requires precision," Donatella continued, her eyes a slow burn. "You, Marco, were the closest I had to a son, and you were not enough until you learned to be ruthless. That is not a condemnation, it is a truth." She looked back at Lena. "You will learn. You must learn." The last week had been an assault of small, strange intimacies and public recalibrations. Lena had learned to move through Donatella's residence like someone learning a new country. She knew where not to breathe, which portraits contained listening devices hidden behind gilt frames, which orchids were real and which were carefully placed decoys meant to distract. She had stood in boardrooms where men who would have ignored her on the street folded when Donatella's name fell from her lips, the air shifting to respect like a tide. She had sat by Donatella's bed as the matriarch smoothed her hand over Lena's hair with a tenderness that made Lena's ribs ache, and she had watched Marco watch them both with an expression as if he were witnessing a treason he did not want to commit. But beneath those days of clinical tutelage and cautious warmth, a current built. Lena's brother, Matteo, still vulnerable in a hospital 2 neighborhoods away, his injured jaw wired in a crooked smile when visitors came. The Mafia's enemies sniffing around the edges like scavengers, and the hidden room that had unlocked in Donatella's private wing, the battered cradle and analog photographs that insisted on memory. Lena couldn't unsee the photograph of a toddler asleep, a mirror of someone she wanted to be for Matteo, a protector, not a commodity swapped for silence. Risk didn't come in grand gestures here. It arrived in the small surgical intrusions that cut away a life. The algorithm leak last night had been a wound that required stitching. Marco had paced until the early hours with a laptop open between his knees, fingers twitching like a pianist waiting for the right chord. At dawn, he had fallen asleep on the kitchen floor, an absurd image of a man who had spent his life defending systems by denying his own rest. Donatella had watched him, and then, privately, had carried his exhausted weight to her bed, as if she had done this for an infant once upon a time and was finding the rhythm of it again. "You didn't tell me you had a grandson," Lena said one evening, unable to contain the ache that had been growing like a foreign plant in her chest. She had come to find them both in the library, dusty books, a bank of screens for Marco's work, and a fire that was more for ceremony than heat. Donatella's face folded like a map. "I didn't tell you because it didn't matter. He is part of this family, and yet he is not always part of me. Blood does not soften decisions." Her voice caught then, just a fraction, as if some old grief had stepped into the margin of the sentence. "I raised him. He is owed loyalty, but loyalty is not blind." "And what about me?" Lena asked. Her hands were clenched in the hem of her sleeve until the fabric dampened. "Am I owed anything besides protection? Am I owed the truth about a room you keep hidden like a beast in the walls?" Donatella's gaze burned with a complicated fire. "The secret room is my past. It is a ledger of pain. You opened it, and that was reckless. It was also necessary." She reached out, uncharacteristically, and placed her cool hand over Lena's knuckles. The sensation was simple, old-knuckled skin over young, but it carried the warmth of someone who had chosen to mark Lena as important. "You will learn what secrets protect you and what secrets poison you." The weeks that followed were an education in both terror and tenderness. Donatella made Lena sit in late meetings where deals were made in code and silence, where men in designer suits spoke of shareholdings and shipments as if they were discussing the weather, and where a wrong expression could cost a life. She coached Lena in courtly cruelties, how to silence a man with a single arch of an eyebrow, how to make a threat without moving a muscle, how to wield silence like a blade. Lena was horrified and fascinated in equal measure. The law inside her head, the one she had dreamed of defending in courtrooms far from Donatella's kind of justice, started to contort, stretch, and reform into something else. Marco became both guide and obstacle. He'd sit with Lena in the aftermath of an evening, translating the technical language Donatella used into something digestible. "They use nodes like blood vessels," he said once, pushing the glasses to the top of his nose. "We build armor where others are vulnerable. We do not want blood unless it's necessary." "And if it's not?" Lena asked. "Then we are cowards." The answer was an old one from his mouth, the kind that signaled a man who had carved his identity on the principle of survival above softness. Yet sometimes, Lena would catch him watching Donatella with an expression that became something like longing, and sometimes he would watch Lena like a secret he did not know he kept. The matter of the secret room, however, remained a pressure point. Donatella allowed Lena to visit it twice more, under supervision. The first time was utter chaos. Lena's hands shook as she lifted a journal with a leather strap eaten at the edges by age. The handwriting inside was curved and intimate and belonged to a woman who had allowed herself to be sentimental once and then erased it. There were names, dates, and then a sudden absence, the kind of omission that shouted more than a confession ever could. A photograph slid from between two pages, a child asleep in sunlight, hair like dark silk and a tiny hand clutching a ragged blanket. Donatella's face went blank at the sight. "Who is this?" Lena asked, the question a small thing, but within it lived 1,000 possibilities. Donatella's voice had a brittle edge. A mistake. Then she breathed, and the words softened. A loss. You said you had no children, Marco said the night he found them with the photographs spread on the bed. He had been working in the room, screens wiped clean of code, and when he turned the corner, he had stopped as if struck. You lied. Donatella did not protest. Lies are a currency here as well, she said. But listen, this is not for you, Marco. It is a wound I keep to remind myself that wounds must exist for you to know when not to bleed. You could have told me, Marco snapped. The anger in him was not for the missing child, but for the way secrets had kept him at a distance from the woman who had raised him. You could have told me, and I would have helped. You think help is always strength, Donatella said, and for a beat she looked like a woman without titles. You think breaking things is the only way to mend them. You hold everything back, Marco said, voice dropping into something that sounded almost like pleading. Stop, Donatella's command sliced the air. Because if you do not, I will stop trusting both of you. I need you to know 3 things. I loved and lost. I did terrible things to survive, and I will do terrible things if our enemies think I am weak. Those words were both anchor and sword. They tethered everyone to the brutal logic that had kept Donatella alive and the syndicate functioning. They also widened the fissures between them. Marco, who lived to protect the network Donatella had made, bristled at the admission of softness. Lena, who had entered this marriage believing it was a shield and not a cage, felt simultaneously warmed by the trust and repulsed by the cost. Outside the walls, danger sharpened. An email leak had routed through one of Donatella's old law firms. Paper trails were being manufactured as bait, and crooked politicians sniffed for any sign of weakness. Rumors spread through the syndicate's quieter channels. A rival in Buenos Aires was testing loyalties by making an offer to one of Donatella's regional bosses. Lena, who had once been used to dorm room arguments and lectures about statute, now found herself listening to conversations about markets in illegal data, how to buy and sell stolen identities, how to launder not only money but influence. At night, Lena would lie awake and trace the map of her life back to the moment she had signed the contract. She had done it for Matteo, who lay brittle and frightened in a hospital bed, who had lost a chance at a future because of a wrong turn and her own lack. Donatella had promised immunity and stability, and it had arrived like a shelter built on the skeleton of someone else's war. But every shelter had a price. Lena felt it pressing against her like a tight-fitting glove, the knowledge that her marriage could be used to trade favors, that she could be called upon to be a public face, a charitable matriarch, while the real decisions were made in code and blood. And yet, there were moments that fell like confetti and made Lena's stern resolve ripple. Donatella taught her the right way to fold napkins for diplomatic dinners and how to keep tea hot long enough to speak when a man expected a woman's hands to be busy. She walked Lena through building a legal narrative that could hide illicit money in layers of philanthropy and corporate shells, a lesson that made Lena dizzy with its audacity. Marco taught her the basics of encryption. His fingers were quick and sure, his patience endless when she fumbled phrases like blockchain and node. He used metaphors to make the language less alien. Think of it like a river, he told her once, drawing a crude sketch on a napkin. You dam here and divert here. You need to know where the currents will shift. Those shared lessons made something intimate that was not yet named. Lena found herself craving Marco's presence like an anchor in rough seas. He would sometimes pause in the doorway to look at her, as if memorizing an image he had no right to keep. Once, when she had cried after a phone call from Matteo's doctor, it was Marco who held the tissue and said nothing. Silence, in their world, was a commodity more valuable than gold. He gave it to her unasked. But Donatella watched that ease with a flinty calm. She did not forbid it, she catalogued it. There was a long, hard night when Lena found herself standing in Donatella's private garden, the fountain whispering, and realized she had been measuring her days by the beat of other people's hearts. The matriarch came up behind her, slipped a hand to rest at the small of her back, and for a moment, Lena thought she might be steadied forever by that touch. "You are learning to move between our worlds," Donatella said softly. "But this is not a place for soft things. Love is a stratagem in my books. It's a way to bind allies, to make people predictable. But it can also be dangerous when it blinds you." Her breath smelled faintly of bergamot. "You must decide if you will be an instrument or a person." "I wanted both," Lena whispered. "To be more than someone who survives. I wanted to be seen." "And you are seen," Donatella countered, almost tenderly, "in the worst and best ways. The world will look for your faults. They will use you to reach me. You must decide how to stand when they do." The decision came sooner than any of them expected. A betrayer, one of the people Donatella had trusted with power in Sao Paulo, switched allegiances when an offer came from a rival syndicate. A shipment was rerouted, and with it, some of Donatella's financial leverage. The syndicate's information nodes began to flicker as if someone were testing which cables were live. Marco stayed awake for 2 nights straight, hunting for the worm that had been planted in their systems, fingers pounding at keys until his knuckles burned. Donatella brought in the old guards. Former allies dusted off their suits and their signatures. Lena sat in the command center, watching the screens, feeling the rawness of exposure as if it were a physical thing scraping against her skin. The betrayer was not executed, not yet, because Donatella needed information that could only be coaxed from traitors by fear and promise. She called a meeting in the private conference room, and Lena was made to sit in the center like a visible pawn. Marco hovered near, the lines around his mouth deeper than Lena had ever seen them. Donatella walked in like she was royalty arriving at a coronation and smiled at the traitor with a courtesy that killed. "You made an imprudent decision," Donatella said, her voice honey-thin, but with an underlying steel. "You thought you could trade your loyalty for better terms. You were mistaken." The traitor was a man who had once laughed in Donatella's presence. Now he looked small. The sort of smallness that comes when someone finally perceives the danger of their own choices. He offered up names like currency, and Donatella took them like she was counting coins. Then she spoke of grace. "I will not kill you, not because I am merciful, but because the information you have is more valuable alive," she said. "You will be useful. You will pay your debt in ways that will be remembered." Marco's jaw worked. Lena had a vision of him stepping forward. She imagined him taking the man's throat in both hands and ending the debate in a flash of brutal efficiency. But he did not move. He was tethered by a loyalty that was older than anger. Lena felt a sudden current of pity for him and for Donatella both. There was no other way to survive in that room than to keep pieces of oneself carefully hidden. After the meeting, Lena wandered down to the kitchens where the staff moved like a river of practiced motions. The dimness felt like sanctuary. She found Marco at the end of a long table, his laptop closed, his head in his hands. "You could have done it," she said quietly. "Done what?" He looked up, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Stopped him. It would have been quick." And then, he wiped his face with the heel of his hand. "And then a dozen men would appear who owe him favors. A dozen when he calls, and a dozen with access to nodes I have yet to secure. You think killing him would secure us more than the intelligence alive could? No, I don't know." Lena's voice broke with its lack of surety. "I only know I don't want to be taught the language of killing." "It's not language, Lena. Marco said softly. "It's practice. You learn it or it eats you." She reached for him impulsively, and he did not pull away. His shoulders were broad and young and somehow wrong for this room. His resistance was the shape of the life Donatella had built, a man cocooned in service, his identity folded into duty. Lena's hand rested against him, and for a dizzy second their proximity rewrote something in both of them. Marco's breath caught. He looked at Donatella's lighter silhouette at the doorway, where the matriarch watched them with an inscrutable expression, and then away again. The push and pull that defined the days became a rhythm. Donatella's iron-handed lessons, Marco's quiet tutelage and occasional flash of heat, Lena's desperate learning curve, and the tender smallness of a woman trying to be more than a shield. Outside, the syndicate's web tightened, enemies whispered, lawmen sniffed, and the city's cracks widened. Inside, the trio formed a nervous mosaic of need and power. Trust was both a weapon and a gesture. One night, as rain tapped against the windows and the city's lights blurred into a watercolor of neon, Lena found herself in Donatella's study, nose buried in the leather-bound journal from the secret room. Marco's words had lodged in her, that some things were instruments, and she had begun to catalog herself in those terms, under necessary, under expendable, under cherished but controlled. She had learned to fold silences and to wear them with pride. Donatella came up behind her, not with the hand to steady, but with a small, crooked smile that made years disappear. "You read my shame," she murmured. "You said it was a ledger," Lena replied, "a place to remember wounds." "Wounds do not heal if you do not touch them," Donatella said. "They fester, they teach, they make you crueler if you hide them." "Is that what you became?" Lena asked, half afraid of the answer. Donatella's silence was a long thing. "I became what I needed to be to keep those I loved alive. Sometimes that requires cruelty. Sometimes that requires mercy." The trick is knowing when to do which. She sat then beside Lena, the two of them dwarfed by mountains of books and the sickly glow of a single lamp. "And sometimes," she added, with a softness that startled Lena, "sometimes I am only afraid." Lena's eyes pricked. "Of what?" "Of the moment when all my armor falls away, and I see that I have nothing left to hide behind." Donatella's hand covered Lena's, and for the first time, Lena felt like an equal in the calculus of secrets. Not because Donatella relinquished power, but because she folded the shape of her vulnerability into the room, making it something Lena could recognize and, perhaps, hold. That night, as sleep finally came in hesitant waves, Lena dreamed of the cradle from the secret room. In the dream, the child turned its face toward her, eyes like small moons, and reached out with a hand that was both tiny and ancient. Lena woke with that reaching hand burned into our palms, and for a moment she thought she might follow where it led. But the world required choices that night and every night. Whether to use the knowledge from the journal to bargain for Matteo's safety, whether to protect Donatella by keeping secrets, whether to speak and risk everything crumbling, or to hold silence and become complicit. Marco would counsel caution. Donatella would insist on control. Lena had to choose what kind of woman she would be in a room full of knives. She would learn that week and the next that choices were never simple. The push and pull between them, protection and freedom, loyalty and truth, would stretch like a wire. It would sing, it would snap, and then be mended with new knots. And, somewhere between the teaching and the betrayal, Lena would find that her own hunger wanted something more than safety. It wanted a life she had not yet dared to imagine. The gunshot that finally broke the night was a punctuation mark in a language Lena had not learned. Abrupt, obscene, and close enough to make the plaster dust fall like confetti. The staff froze mid-step in the kitchen. The fountain's whisper in the garden stopped as if someone's palm had clamped the water. Marco's head snapped up so fast his neck made a small, painful sound. Donatella moved with the same immediate gravity she used to command boardrooms, sliding a hand into the small of Lena's back and steering her away from the heavy window that framed the city like a wound. "Down," Donatella said, voice low, the word a blade that cut to action. Bodies folded into practiced sloppiness, the kind designed to confuse anyone watching security tapes later. Lena's heart pummeled in her chest, a live thing. For a flicker, she could not name whether fear was a physical reaction or an ethics class unspooling into survival instinct. Marco was already at the console, palms skimming keys, eyes scanning feeds with the quiet of a surgeon. "It's the East Wing," someone whispered. "2 shots, in the corridor." Donatella's jaw tightened. Lockdown, now. Her order snapped through the room, and men and women poured into channels like obedient water. The syndicate that looked civil on paper had a spinal cord made of routines. Donatella had practiced each of them until they were reflex. Lena slid into that mechanism, small and flailing at first, then mechanical as a puppet learning to string itself. They moved as if someone had carved choreography from panic. Marco's fingers danced. The building's inner map bloomed on the monitors, corridors, offices, service shafts. A red dot pulsed near the private suite where the secret room lay, like an old photograph nobody wanted revived. The hole in Lena's chest widened because the secret room's existence had been a risk from the beginning. That anyone could find its heartbeat now meant everything Donatella had guarded could be turned into currency. "Who's down there?" Donatella asked without looking at anyone in particular. "One of our drivers," a security captain said. "Tracking says he should have been on the 3rd floor. He's bleeding fast." "Get him out. Quiet. No alarms beyond this building." Donatella's voice was function and iron. Lena felt herself pulled forward by the gravity of orders. She slipped on a pair of disposable gloves and followed the team as if her presence mattered beyond optics. It did. Donatella liked to show the world she was not a matriarch kept safely distant. She liked visible proof that she could drag herself into the mud. Lena's presence was theater for the cameras, proof to the world that the poor bride was guarded by an empire. But tonight, it was also flesh in the corridor where blood had pooled. They found the driver in a pool of his own life, legs twisted, breath a thin thing catching against pain. A man had fired twice and run. The shooter left with the celerity of someone who had not wanted confrontation. Marco bent, hands steadying despite the tremor Lena could see in his jaw. "It's a warning," he said, voice hard, too hard. "Testing a perimeter." "From whom?" Donatella queried, eyes ice-honed. The question was rhetorical. There were always contenders. There was always a hand somewhere trying to tilt an empire. "The Argentinians," the captain said. "A regional boss who's been pushing. He's been courting our Sao Paulo contacts. He's angry." Donatella's face collapsed for the smallest of beats, the sort of moment that told Lena more than a confession could have. It was a flash of calculus, money at risk, nodes threatened, and pride bruised. Then we remind him why we are not to be tested. "Not with reprisals," Marco said sharply. "With evidence. If we are known for killing without consequences, they will consolidate against us. They will build a coalition. We need to be surgical." "Surgical?" Donatella's laugh was a brittle thing that had teeth. "You speak of surgery, and yet you shrink whenever a man bleeds. You will learn, Marco." Her look was not cruel but inevitable. "We will remove him as a problem, quietly, and then we will take a node of his and make it ours." "To take him alone will cost us more than the theft," Marco protested. "We need leverage." Donatella's gaze cut to Lena. For a second, Lena thought she saw not the matriarch, but a woman who had once been only a shadow of tenderness and irritation. "Lena," she said softly, "you opened my room. You hold a piece of my past like a candle. People will think to coax that flame for heat and light. If they succeed, they will burn the house down." Lena's fingers cramped on the disposable glove. "Then we stop them," she managed. The words came out small, but she meant them. She wanted to be more than a pawn. She wanted to act. "You will learn to be a blade with a handle," Donatella said. "You will learn to cut in places that do not leave visible marks." She extended a small, keen look. "But remember, we are not only predators. Predators make mistakes when they forget their own borders." The driver was taken to a safe room. The wound would not kill him tonight. But the city had shifted in a way Lena could taste like metal. The next morning, there was a message waiting in the secure channel Marco had shown her. A cropped image of the secret room's cradle, grainy but unmistakable, and a line of type. "We know where you keep your ghosts." The trio convened in the war room. Maps of flow, lists of nodes, notation in Marco's precise script littered the whiteboards. Donatella's face was carved into a mask of thought. "This is escalation," she said. "They want leverage." "Who sent it?" Lena asked, hands clasped like a child's. "Either the Argentinians or someone with knowledge of them," Marco said. He looked at Donatella as if she might parse truth from posture. "Or an internal leak. Someone fed intelligence to them." Donatella's shoulders tightened. "We will run a sweep. Every contract, every offsite, every person who touched my private wing." She tapped the board with a nail that carried a persona of steel. "We will find who dared to threaten me with my past." The sweep did not go smoothly. Old words of trust, carefully stacked for decades, showed hairline fractures. A legal counsel Lena had once seen as a dry, humdrum man turned out to be an agent for a foreign intelligence fold. A compliance officer had family in a disputed territory whose life depended on favors from the other side. Secrets, once unearthed, were like rotten fruit. They stained everything they touched. Worse, a data trail emerged that suggested someone within Donatella's inner legal circle had indeed attempted to broker the photographs and the journal to the Argentinians in exchange for protection and a slice of future revenue. Lena felt a collision of anger and dread when she heard that. The betrayal was not crude. It wore the fine suit of an insider who believed they could play both sides for personal gain. "Who?" Donatella demanded, not letting the room breathe. "It's Luca," Marco said. The name landed like an anvil. Luca had been Donatella's counsel for 10 years, a man who had folded wills and papers for the matriarch, who had smiled with ease in Donatella's presence. Lena had once thought him dull. Now the word treachery clung to him. Luca was summoned. He arrived thin, eyes darting. A man who had convinced himself he could be both loyal and opportunistic showed the tremors of someone caught unraveling. He argued that fear had made him pragmatic, that if the Argentinians could guarantee him immunity and a new life, he would be justified. He tried to smile his way out. It did not work. "You misread loyalty," she said. "You replaced it with fear. And then you tried to sell me to feel safe." Luca started. The man was suddenly very young. Donatella considered the world as if she were browbeating a recalcitrant child. "You will live because I have need of information you have served. But you will be watched. You will understand that choice makes you ugly." She didn't say kill. She did not have to. Her sentence hung like a verdict. Marco stood as if to pull Luca into the next stage. But Lena held up a hand. This was the fracture she hadn't expected. The moment where she would either take the easier path and keep silence for the shelter Donatella provided, or speak in a way that could cause damage but might protect her brother in a more immediate way. "You knew about the room," Lena said to Luca, voice steady despite the tremor she felt. It surprised even her that the question had the authority to hold a room still. Luca looked between Lena and Donatella like a man seeing two judges. "I saw it," he admitted. I sold the image, not knowing its worth. I thought to have a margin. I did not know what you do." "You betrayed us," Marco said, not gentle this time. There was a hunger in his tone, not for blood, but for a kind of justice that would correct trust. "It wasn't betrayal," Luca declared, defensive and stubborn. "It was survival." "Survival is the argument of cowards," Donatella replied. "You took a piece of my past and offered it because you wanted to be safe. You cannot claim survival when you gamble with other people's lives to secure your own." Luca's face dissolved into shame. He would live, but he would be monitored, and that was worse for someone who had thought himself clever. He left the room under watch, but the damage, the possibility of selling Donatella's past had done could not be cleaned with surveillance alone. The image had already been bait, and with bait came teeth. The next fracture was quieter but more devastating. A ledger surfaced in an off-site vault, a list of names, phone numbers, and a string of transactions that suggested Donatella had once negotiated with a high-ranking government official to bury a scandal. The implication was a dangerous one. If that official's name were to be revealed, multiple governments could be pulled into a hush of embarrassment that could force alliances to shift. For the syndicate, this meant that their sphere of protection could either expand or contract overnight based on someone else's whim. Donatella's reaction was not the fury Lena expected, but something like exhaustion. "They will come knocking with offers," she said. "They will try to buy silence instead of paying for consequences." Donatella's hands, which had been poised like royalty 100 times, trembled for a fraction. Marco was furious at being excluded from the ledger's creation. He had designed systems to prevent exactly this sort of vulnerability. "Someone put old paper back into circulation," he hissed. "Someone who knows how we clean our tracks when we need to." "You think I could forget?" Donatella's laugh was hollow. "We are not saviors, Marco. We were pragmatic. We bent the law like others bend a knee." The ledger, the photograph, the whisper campaign, they all coalesced into a strategy launched by someone who wanted to unseat Donatella by exposing the parts of her that smelled like flesh instead of armor. Lena began to see how fragile the scaffolding around power truly was. It was not steel so much as stories kept in place. Take away the stories, and the structure shook. The crack that finally split the trio came not from outside, but from inside. Marco, pressed by loyalty and his own suffocating conscience, began to leak controlled information to a contact who promised immunity for Matteo in exchange for a dossier that would show Donatella's willingness to protect family at any cost. He justified it as leverage, a way to bargain for Lena's brother without blood. But to Lena, it was betrayal. The moment she learned, it felt like someone had ripped a quilt off a sleeping child. "You promised me you would not play diplomat with my life," Donatella said when the truth came out, voice small and raw. For once, the matriarch's control slipped. She showed a woman who had been loved and wounded and was tired of being negotiated with. "I had to try," Marco said, his voice breaking like weather in late winter. "You said there were things you would not do. I thought I could find another way." "You found a way to put him at greater risk," Lena snapped. Her anger was fierce enough to frighten her own hands. Do you know what they will do if they smell bargaining? They will test you. They will test him. They will use him to see if you will break. Marco's eyes were wide and red. I did it for Matteo, for you. His voice squeezed out ragged. I couldn't watch you hold all the cards and think there was no other way. You chose a way that makes you judge and executioner, Donatella said. You have always thought your heart could fix the world. It cannot. Not in here. The room went silent like a chapel. Marco's body seemed to shrink beneath the weight of Donatella's disappointment. Lena could feel the walls of the fortress closing in with new pressure. Betrayal had a sound, not a shout, but a soft, cold realization that trust had fissured. You will be punished, Donatella said finally, not cruelly, but with the fatalism of someone who knew the economy of consequences. You will be given tasks that make your hands dirty. You will learn what it is to be inside the machine. You will not decide alone again. Marco knuckled his eyes. I will accept. Lena, who had come seeking sanctuary and truth, sat at the edge of the great table and watched two pillars of her new world fracture. She felt something in herself break and remold, a stubborn, defiant insistence that she would not be merely a ledger entry in a negotiation. She would not be the thing someone traded to leverage a matriarch's weakness. Then I will be part of the bargains, she said suddenly, and the room turned as if someone had tossed a marble into still water. If you must use me as leverage, use me openly. Do not let my name be something whispered in corridors. I am not property to be pawned. Donatella's gaze softened like dusk. You will not be pawned, she promised, and whether it was a lie to comfort or a strategy to preserve, Lena could not say. The fractures spread outward like a stain. Loyalties rearranged themselves. Allies chose sides based on whispers and self-interest. Marco, scarred by the chastening, dove into missions that made him harder, less sentimental. Donatella retreated to her archives, folding her exposed vulnerabilities into new armor. Lena learned that secrets could be weapons and shields at once, and that the people who wielded them decided whether the blade was justice or cruelty. In the quiet after the meltdowns, when the city's lights blurred into weary embers, Lena sat at the cradle again, fingers ghosting the worn wood. The room that had been a repository of Donatella's secrets had become a battlefield. The photographs looked back at her like witnesses. The journal lay open where she had last read it, words curling like smoke. There was tenderness there, and terrible choices. There was a child whose existence had been erased and then weaponized. She thought of Matteo in his hospital bed, jaw wired, breath steady but life uncertain. If Lena had to become a ledger to keep him safe, a public matriarch who smiled at charity dinners while teeth worked in hidden networks, she would. But she also felt the small, bright rebellion in her chest that had led her to law books and midnight shifts, the desire to write truth plainly and have it hold. She understood now that the law inside Donatella's world was not black and white, but a spectrum of survival. Outside the nest of walls, someone would be celebrating their progress. Someone would be that much closer to breaking Donatella or to becoming one of the new powers who would thrive in a world without her. Lena knew that to navigate the fracturing, she would have to become less naive and more deliberate. She would have to take the lessons Donatella offered and translate them into a different language, one where her brother's life did not cost her soul. The secret room's shadows lengthened as night bled into a thin blue. Lena closed the journal and pressed the photograph of the child to her heart as if in prayer. Secrets, she had learned, could be absolution and accusation. They could sink empires or save single lives. In the midst of fractures and revelations, there was this small and stubborn truth. Sometimes the only way forward was to choose which things to burn and which to shelter. She would. She had no other recourse. Donatella's hand found the small of Lena's back as if it were an anchor, and for a breath Lena surrendered to the steadiness. They stood in the war room while the city murmured threats beyond thick glass, and the three of them, Donatella, Marco, Lena, felt like a constellation that had been abruptly rearranged. Marco's punishment had not been exiled. It had been immersion. He was already gone. Sleeves rolled, orders barked at operatives as he dove into tasks that dirty the hands of someone who had spent a life hiding tenderness behind code. Donatella watched him move with a calculation that was both maternal and merciless. "We can spin this," Donatella said quietly, her voice a velvet blade. "We make the ledger a story of protection, not conspiracy. We feed a narrative where I used old alliances to shelter friends. They will accept a matriarch's favors more easily than they accept a criminal's confession." "Or we use it as bait," Marco said, emerging from the console with a new set of maps. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue, but there was a metallic brightness to them now. "We leak a page to a contact in Buenos Aires framed as a disgruntled bureaucracy. They will make a move, and the mover will expose themselves. Then we cut." Lena listened, pulse steadying as the plan articulated. For a second, the three of them were a machine. Donatella's strategy, Marco's technical precision, Lena's legal mind newly tempered by nights of watching the world tilt on the axis of decisions. The idea of using the ledger as bait made Lena's skin prickle. It also made something in her feel dangerous and alive. It was not the same as bargaining with a human life. This was chess. "We set contingencies," Donatella went on. "If they attempt a smear, our acceptable narrative is that I appealed to officials to protect civilians tied to my philanthropic fronts. We leak philanthropy receipts dated before the ledger entries. We muddy the water so that when they come with accusations, they don't know what to fish." Marco nodded. "I can create a traceback to the Argentinians' handlers. If they lift, we trace, isolate, cripple their funding nodes. Luca can be used as an unknowing vector. Hell, he'll give them access, and we close the door. We don't need blood to break them. We need to show their sponsors the net." Lena felt the pull of an old moral axis, her law school morality tugging for a straight line, and she let it go like a coat in the wind. There was no pure line here, but there could be an arc that shielded Matteo and reduced collateral. "We set contingencies," Donatella went on. "If they attempt a smear, our acceptable narrative is that I appealed to officials to protect civilians tied to my philanthropic fronts. We leak philanthropy receipts dated before the ledger entries. We muddy the water so that when they come with accusations, they don't know what to fish." Marco nodded. "I can create a traceback to the Argentinians' handlers. If they lift, we trace, isolate, cripple their funding nodes. Luca can be used as an unknowing vector. Hell, he'll give them access, and we close the door. We don't need blood to break them. We need to show their sponsors the net." Lena felt the pull of an old moral axis, her law school morality tugging for a straight line, and she let it go like a coat in the wind. There was no pure line here, but there could be an arc that shielded Matteo and reduced collateral. "And Matteo?" she asked. "Whatever moves we make, his safety is still immediate." "Guaranteed," Donatella said, and the word landed like a contract. She turned her gaze to Lena and, for the first time, let the softness in her voice be wholly private. "I will place him at a hospital ringed by friends who owe me debts larger than favors. He will be moved tonight if risk assessment deems it safer." Lena felt tears she couldn't name gather. She had signed a contract to protect him. She had not expected the protection to feel like this, strategic, surgical, and layered with the kind of intimacy that made her stomach flip. She found Marco watching her, eyes unreadable, and for a moment the plan fell away. Between them was a tremulous space where belonging and fear mingled. "You know you'll pay for this with more secrets," Marco said eventually, the admission a notch lower than a confession. "Every layer we add to hide the ledger is another lie we keep between us." "I know," Lena replied, "but I will learn to bend my truth if it keeps him breathing." They moved with the choreography of people who knew the cost of hesitation. Marco dove into code to create false leads and honey points that would look like sloppy leaks to a rival, but were actually tripwires. Donatella called in favors older than Marco's memory, her voice a soft command that opened doors and bought time. Lena took the ledger and, under Donatella's watchful, almost tender tutelage, translated its footnotes into plausible philanthropic audits, overlaying generosity where ledger entries had once smelled of barter. She forged a narrative in paper and email that looked like a matriarch protecting those her empire had, in part, harmed. The first test came in a callous, thin-lettered email sent to a known associate of the Argentine boss. It contained a grainy reproduction of the ledger and a whisper of blackmail. "Pay, or we expose." Lena's stomach dropped when she clicked send on the planted counter, an invitation typed in Donatella's rhetorical voice, offering the ledger as a tale of noble protection rather than the instrument of power the world expected. The reply rippled across their secure channel in minutes. Curiosity, not rage. It was what they needed, a probe. Within an hour, a satellite account pinged one of Marco's planted nodes. An intermediary showed interest in brokering a leak. Marco smiled a dangerous smile, the kind Lena had rarely seen. "They bite the line," he murmured. "We reel." Their net worked. Agents on the other side exposed themselves. Their funding sources were traced and quietly cut. Diplomatic channels, when threatened with embarrassment, chose quiet folding rather than public inquiry. The Argentinians, humiliated and stripped of a sponsor's cover, retreated. It was surgical and clean and maddeningly satisfying. Donatella watched the cascade, but her eyes did not celebrate. There was a fatigue in her that Lena recognized now, the weight of a ruler who would always be asked to do the impossible. Yet victory tasted of iron. In the same days that they reclaimed their narrative, someone on the other side, bitter and cornered, hit the one place Donatella had feared most, the hospital where Matteo rested. Lena learned of the attempt when the phone in her pocket lit up with a frantic message. Someone had been observed near the children's ward, a shadow that had lingered too long. Donatella's reaction was immediate, not political. She folded herself into a storm of motion, dragging Lena with her. They arrived at the hospital like an edict. Donatella's presence ordered the nurses into secrecy. Marco, who had been told to keep watch, stayed in the corridor like an uneasy sentinel. Lena found Matteo wrapped in a blanket, his cheek pale and fragile. When he slept, his face was unharmed by the wars outside it. The presence of Donatella by the bedside was not like a visitor's. It was the visitation of someone who had been forged by loss. She sat down, placed a hand on Matteo's, and did not speak for a long time. "You were scared," Donatella whispered finally, and Matteo's fingers twitched as if in a dream. Her voice was a small thing, the size of a confession. Lena realized then that Donatella's cruelty had never been monstrous without reasons. It had been armor chosen out of terror. When a woman loses a child, she either melts or hardens. Donatella had been both, and she had learned to channel grief into governance. "We will move him," Donatella said to Lena, eye steady now. "Tonight. A round of ceremonies and delays that will make the Watchers think their threats were successful. Then he goes someplace they cannot find." Lena wanted to weep with relief and with rage that they had been forced into these maneuvers. She wanted to tell Donatella that the cradle in the secret room did not make her less formidable, but more human. Instead, she rested her forehead against Matteo's hair and let the plan do the talking. That night, they executed an exodus that felt like ritual. Donatella's old allies staged a funeral procession for an invented relative. Their phone channels hummed with false grief. Marco orchestrated digital noise to drown real-time patient records. Lena rode in the van with Matteo between them, fingers laced with Donatella's in a grip that was both maternal and possessive. In that moment, the three of them were a strange, fragile family. A matriarch who had built an empire to survive, a grandson who had learned to exact justice in code, and a poor law student whose bargain had become something else, a choice to claim agency in a world that traded in silence. Outside, the city pulsed with predators and opportunists. Inside the van, for the first time in a long time, Lena let herself breathe. She and Donatella had made sacrifices that night. The matriarch softer in places Lena had not expected, Marco harder where his conscience had been a wound. And yet, something tender braided through all of it, the refusal to let a child be collateral. When the van stopped and they walked into a safe house ringed with friends who owed debts the size of promises, Donatella turned to Lena. "You did well," she said. The words were simple and rare. Lena answered with a smile that was not pure joy, but a relief pressed into hope. "We did it together," Lena corrected. Marco watched them, a shadow of longing behind his newly steeled face. That night, as rain again tapped the windows, the three of them sat in an unfamiliar silence that felt like repair. There would be more fractures ahead, more bargains to make and break. But in the quiet, Lena realized the path forward would not be to tear Donatella's empire down, nor to be consumed by it. Instead, she would learn to hold parts of it dangerously and tenderly, crafting new rules where family could be both weapon and refuge. In the fragile space between vengeance and mercy, Lena chose to bind herself not as a pawn, but as a partner in a precarious, necessary love that had nowhere to be ordinary and everything to be true. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the city scrubbed and honest. In the safe house kitchen, Lena stood at the window with a mug cooling in her hands. Matteo slept upstairs, restless from medicine and dreams. Donatella moved around them like a guardian, learning gentleness. Softer than the marble Lena had first met, yet steeled in place where it mattered. Marco leaned against a battered table, watching with a silence that read as apology and promise. The aftermath had not made them less complicated. If anything, loss and repair had layered them into truer versions. Lena breathed, tasting coffee and old paper, and felt for the first time since the contract signed that her choices had weight and warmth. "You were reckless," Donatella said, not as accusation, but as recognition, when Lena turned to her. "I was," Lena admitted. "I needed to be." Donatella sat, and for a moment the matriarch's armor showed hairline cracks. "So did I," she confessed, and their hands found each other across the table, small proof that two weapons could lay down together. Marco crossed the room, closing the distance with the clumsy grace of someone learning to say more than code. He took Lena's other hand, and the three of them formed a triangle soft with exhaustion and fierce fidelity. They spoke quietly of small futures, Matteo's slow walks in a courtyard, a legal clinic Lena would open, Marco's code used to protect, not to punish. Donatella outlined a plan that was less empire and more shelter. Nodes spun toward rescue, funds diverted to clinics, and a promise that her secrets would be bartered only when there was no other gain. They were not naive. Compromise tasted bitter, and some debts would never be forgiven. But in the amber quiet, Lena understood that love in their world was not delicate as glass, but weatherproof, a shelter built to withstand storms. Later, when they walked through the safe-house garden, Marco stopped under a lemon tree and looked at Donatella first, then at Lena. "We will keep him," he said, voice level with a new calm. "We will keep each other." The words were small, almost ordinary, but they felt like absolution. Donatella reached up, brushed a strand of his hair, and for one ridiculous heartbeat, she laughed. Not the brittle laugh of command, but a short, surprised thing. Lena leaned into that laughter.